Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope you had a lovely weekend. I certainly did. This week, we're going to start discussing the empirical record. And I really mean the contemporary modern period since about 1960, 1970. And this part of the course will pick up a lot of those thematic threads that we began weaving in those early weeks. And we'll start to talk about policies and arrangements and institutions that were put in place in pursuit of different development models that relate to those theories. And so we'll start with import substitution industrialization. We'll deal then with neoliberal economics. And in both of these units, we'll follow the same course. We will sketch out the policies and the arrangements and the institutions that related to that model. And then we'll talk about how the model sort of fell apart, so to speak. And this is really about the crisis, reform, and collapse of these different economic models. And again, we're drawing a link between those theories that we've discussed already and then these economic models as sets of policies. And you'll see in very clear terms the connections between them. Now, before we continue, let me just address the midterm. The midterm is on March 12th. It will take place in class and it will consist of multiple choice and short answer responses. I do intend to distribute a review guide that you can complete and that will identify the topics for review, the concepts, and the readings. This is the strategy and the approach that I like to use. I'll give you at least a week to complete and prepare for the exam. And that review guide won't be for credit or extra credit, but I do encourage you to complete it and have it done so that you're prepared for the exam. It is only March 1st, so we do have still a couple weeks before the exam. So I do want to leave this for now, and we'll pick it up in a few days when I'll talk more about it. But you can be rest assured that you will receive a review guide and that we'll have plenty of time and space to address questions that might come up. And at that, I'd like to just give you an opportunity to make any comments or ask any questions that you might have about where we are in the course, about what we have left, about the way that what we'll do in here for the remainder of this semester will work.
We're still going to have a paper at some point, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, there's a paper later in the semester, and I'll give you some more information about that as well. But at this point, the syllabus does provide a description of that assignment, and I expect that you'll have plenty of space to complete that once you finish the midterm. It's not like a semester long engagement as far as I'm concerned, but I will give you a model or sort of an example, and we'll kind of do a writing workshop in here in lecture one day. I think that those are really useful so that we can clarify the criteria for the papers. But yes, there will be a paper, and that will be quite different than the problem set and even a little bit different than the midterm and the final. So there's a lot of diversity in the assignments in this class. In the past, I've done mostly papers, but in a course like this, there's real value to be placed on problem sets and stuff like that. All right, everybody. Are there any other comments or questions before we get started? All right, let's get started. So we're going to deal with Latin America this week because ISI and import substitution industrialization really sort of got its wings in Latin America. It was in those countries where this economic model was adopted the earliest, and it was most widespread in the Latin American countries. And so we'll learn a lot from their experience, although we will draw some comparisons to some Middle Eastern countries and even some Asian countries. But as we get started, I want us to begin thinking about the kinds of processes and the activities that fall under this rubric ISI. If you go to Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, you'll find a lot of scenes like this: domestic car production in factories owned by the state and subsidized with state credit from state owned banks, producing cars and other goods with inputs that might be imported from abroad, but that are used to make products that are sold domestically. And this focus on national domestic production was really the hallmark of ISI. Although the inputs in the raw materials often came from elsewhere, the products that were produced for the domestic market. And the idea was that, these state owned industries and factories would produce cars and planes. They would provide oil and petrochemicals, and the economy would be self-sustaining and would be self-subsistent. It would be a completely internal, self-sufficient economy in the way that they produced everything that they might need, albeit with items that they import from abroad. And so the image of car production is an image that becomes synonymous with ISI. And this is a photo from Brazil, where car production was just one focus of the ISI program. This is another photo from Brazil. And as far as I can tell, this is a photo from an aircraft company called Embraer. And Embraer is today the single biggest aircraft company in Latin America, if I'm not mistaken. At the time, it was part owned by the state, or specifically, it was part owned by the military and part owned by the private sector. And Embraer produced planes for military as well as commercial and private entities. And Embraer became especially large in the 90s when it became really a juggernaut. That was also a period when the firm was privatized. But in the 60s and the 70s, images like this were closely related to ISI in the understanding of the state's role in the economy as one that was a central leading role and that involved, producing those items that we associate with industry and in the production of goods that might otherwise have been imported, but in this case were produced domestically. If you go to Argentina, you can see images like this. This is a map that shows you just a handful of the companies in Argentina's vertically integrated domestic defense industry. And basically, in that country, the military owned several dozen large enterprises that were concentrated in the public sector, in defense, petrochemicals, steel, and the entire production process was embedded and rolled into this vertically integrated defense industry. And you would then see the word fabrica militar or fabricaciones militares, military factories, all over, because those were the institutions and the organizations of the state involved in the production of defense goods and steel and petrochemicals. These military companies together constituted about a third of the output of the Argentine economy. And it was in no small way a juggernaut. And Argentina at the time was one of the largest economies in the entire region of Latin America. And so these are the kinds of sights and sounds and scenes that you would associate with ISI. And I've sort of given it away already, but what does all of this have to do with ISI? Why does domestic car production or a vertically integrated defense industry relate to ISI? What is it about those things that follow from ISI, or from what we understand to be the approach of import substitution industrialization? Does anyone want to address that question?
Well, the Argentine government made a conscious decision to have the military run these industries instead of uh, importing the the things they wanted to produce from abroad.
Or even letting the private sector do it instead, right? They could import those items, they could allow the private sector to do it. But Matt is right. That's a conscious policy choice. I'm especially thinking about those of you in economics. Is there anything natural about the military owning and managing huge capital enterprises? That's not at all natural. That doesn't follow from the classical economic playbook. But from the perspective of ISI, that's totally normal, because ISI is all about using the power and the capacity of the state to develop industries in those areas of the economy that the private sector either can't or won't develop. And so this means making that conscious policy choice, as Matt says, choosing to involve the military in the economy, in steel and petrochemicals, in defense, in all of these areas. And to be clear and to reiterate, there are choices, right? It's not necessarily obvious that the military would be involved in this way. In a lot of countries, the private sector is the primary actor involved in producing defense or steel or petrochemical goods. In a lot of countries, they import those items. In a lot of countries, the military is involved in those sectors, but in most of those cases, it's because it's a product of the ISI period. And so in countries like Pakistan and Egypt, the military got heavily involved in the economy during the period of protectionism and domestically driven ISI strategies. And so as we get into this and as we start thinking about ISI and this approach to economic policy, I want you to be thinking about the role of the state and what kinds of assumptions dependency theory makes about the need for the state to intervene to help to correct the insertion of countries in the periphery of the world economy. What does dependency theory tell us about what the government must do to sort of throw off the shackles of dependence and in relations of dependence? Well, dependency theory says that the state has to get involved, and one of those actors in the state is the military. And so ISI often went hand in hand with a role for the military in strategic areas of the economy. And we can't write a dissertation about this, but before we continue, what we'll say is that one of the reasons that the military often gets involved in these situations is because in these weak states where the state is relatively weak, or civilian institutions are relatively weak, the military has a monopoly on information and organization. And so states, technocrats, decision makers put the military in charge where they have a strategic or a tactical objective. And the objective is to use the power and the organization of the state through the military to harness the necessary means to develop the economy and to grow enterprises and to channel resources and to make decisions in a decisive way that often has eluded the private sector or those public institutions that are civilian institutions. And so what we're going to do is we're going to examine the political economy of ISI in Latin America. And this is a conversation that has us thinking about interests and the benefits that different actors derive from their position in the economy, in the different relationships between the state and the market. But it also has us talking about ideas and the role of different sets of beliefs about how markets and states work and how politics and economics works. And so, as I said, this is that point where we begin to deal with more of the empirical record, right? We're not dealing with theory for its sake anymore. We're really starting with the empirics and the experiences of whole regions and whole countries. And we're going to reach a set of conclusions based on the analysis of these experiences. And so this is an empirical exercise. This is that point in the course where we begin to pivot and we start to think more about the experience, the lived experience of the people in these places that decision makers have tried to develop during this period that we're studying. So our starting point is Latin America, really in 1880. We're going to go back as far as 1880 because this is the period in time when most of Latin America was finally independent. The 1800s was a period of violence and disorder and conflict in Latin America. And the period of state building lasted about 80 years after the beginning of independence in the early 1800s. Well, actually, 50 years, pardon me. It was a long period of chaos and disorder as those Latin American countries began to organize themselves and establish states in political institutions, and as they began to sort of consolidate central institutions and state institutions, they began to integrate the economy in the global economy. And in particular, the Latin American countries specialized in exporting primary products like coffee and rubber, cocoa, cotton, silver, copper, oil, agricultural products, wood, silver, you name it. All of these things were exported primarily by Latin American countries, and they developed comparative advantages in those. And so Mexico, for example, primarily exported silver, copper, oil, agricultural products like beef and grain, as did Argentina. Brazil exported coffee, rubber, cocoa, cotton, wood, Brazil wood. These primary commodities became central to the economic profile of these countries, and they became quite dependent on these exports. When the Latin American economies began to open up to investment from Europe and the United States at the end of the 1800s, European immigrants began to fill all parts of the region. And in particular, cities like Buenos Aires became hubs for European immigrants. Buenos Aires is well known as being sort of a hub for Italians, for example. And sometimes they'll say, we're more European than we are Latin American. That's debatable, but it certainly is important to think about some of the changes in immigration patterns and how investment led eventually to European immigrants filling parts of the region in large numbers. And by 1900s, the economies are really industrializing. And this is a period when they're beginning to embrace investments of large proportions of national income in all sorts of heavy industries like steel and in petrochemicals, all kinds of industrial sectors that involved heavier and more long-term investments than many of those exports of primary products did. By the 1900s, countries like Argentina and Mexico are booming. And by about 1915, believe it or not, Argentina was actually like the richest country in the world. And it's because at that point, Argentina had really cornered the market sort of in terms of beef and grain exports. But the country was also industrializing relatively rapidly because of investments in communications and rail and transportation, early investments in defense industries and petrochemicals, steel. But by the 1930s, the region is increasingly becoming isolated from the global economy because the Great Depression, which begins to set in this period, separates Latin America from the rest of the world. And this is a period in time when all countries of the world begin withdrawing from the global economy. And all national economies, with few exceptions, had been built on producing and exporting goods. And the Latin American countries had built their economies on exporting commodities. Even though they'd begun the process of industrialization, even countries like Argentina still disproportionately relied on the global market for their exports of primary source resources and commodities like beef and grain, agricultural products. So this incipient industrialization gets cut off by the Great Depression. And suddenly the region is isolated from the global market, as are essentially all countries of the world, as countries individually began withdrawing and sort of returning to isolationism. It used to be the case that consumer goods could be imported from the United States and Europe relatively cheaply. In fact, in the 19 teens, markets, global markets were perhaps freer than ever before, and financial integration as well as trade were extensive. And that meant that it was relatively easy for Latin Americans to get the things that they might want and that they could import from the US and from Europe. And as you can imagine, those were primarily those finished goods that the Latin American countries weren't yet producing cheaply enough or well enough, to persuade Latin American consumers to purchase domestically. And so it used to be easy to get those imported goods, but suddenly, with the onset of the Great Depression and the withdrawal of national economies and in the return of isolation, it became much more difficult to import those finished goods from the US and Europe. And this meant then that there was suddenly an economic void. There was a need for those products that previously could be obtained from the United States and Europe, but that could no longer be obtained because of high tariffs that had been imposed as a result of withdrawal from the global economy in the Great Depression. And there's suddenly great local demand for products that are not produced domestically. And gradually, over the course of the next decade, new industries began to emerge to meet local demand. And this process of industrialization that was set off in the early 1900s begins to really pick up pace. And it's catalyzed by the period of the Great Depression because of the way in which Latin America was cut off from the rest of the world and access to global markets. And this in turn had all sorts of social and socioeconomic and economic consequences. And the most important of those was the emergence of large classes of urban middle class workers. Suddenly, Latin American democracies and economies are beginning to sort of modernize, and large middle classes are beginning to emerge as a result of the rise of new industries built to meet local demand for finished goods that were previously provided by the United States and Europe. So you've got new industries, and then those new industries cause the formation of new working classes. Labor unions begin to emerge, and suddenly you've got the formation of a new kind of urban political geography, if you will, primarily around new industries and middle classes. Now, all the while, throughout the rest of the world, and especially the United States, Britain, and Western European allies, they're reaching monetary and trade agreements that are designed to facilitate opening up the global economy again. And they're trying to get countries to come back to the drawing board and the conference table to work together to open up trade agreements again and open up those global markets so that they can facilitate re-economic integration. And the idea is, let's go halfway. Let's not totally liberate these markets. Let's open up channels and pathways for trade in exchange and integration while still allowing governments mechanisms to meet their own domestic policy goals. And this looked a little bit different everywhere, but generally speaking, countries would adopt a fixed exchange rate and they would impose limits on the movement of capital so that they could allow the free movement of goods via trade, but still have some control over domestic policy through taxing and spending and through control of the money supply. We don't have a lot of space to go into some of these dynamics of the international economy. We're more interested in the sort of domestic implications and how Latin American economies respond to this movement towards what was called embedded liberalism. And the idea was, let's bring about limited integration. Let's give states influence over employment and prices domestically while opening back up those channels for trade by chiefly reducing tariffs on imports and exports. And we can do so in a way that is partial and is piecemeal. This was called embedded liberalism. And so you'll notice that in 1947, the average tariff level, which is a tariff is basically a tax on imports or exports. And I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence. You may or may not know that, but so that we're all on the same page, when we say tariffs, we're referring to the tax burden that falls on imports or exports. And so the average tariff level in 1947 was about 40% of the price of the product. By 1987, the average tariff level had fallen substantially to about less than 5%. And as you can see, as the average tariff level fell, the trade volume index, or the total volume of trade between countries, increased exponentially. And in fact, it's a pretty linear relationship. You see that as tariffs fell, the trade volume increased, because as it became cheaper and cheaper in terms of tariffs in the tax burden to import or export goods, countries imported and exported more goods, and vice versa as you go forward, as you go back in time. So this is the post-World War II global economy. And the reason that we're setting this up is so that we can understand how Latin America fit in and what they were responding to when they pursued the path that they pursued. And so everyone, keep this in mind, put this in the back of your head. And now I want to put this question to you. Simple question. Does Latin America join in? Does Latin America join the rest of the advanced countries in sort of embracing this embedded liberalism, free trade with some domestic control over employment and prices? Any takers?
It was the region that rejected that idea the most.
So the answer is no. And it was the region that rejected the idea the most. Does anyone have anything that you want to add to that? Is there anything about Latin America that made them, or that sort of went along with this rejection of embedded liberalism? Where did dependency theory come from? So the answer is no. Latin America did not join in. And the rest of the story is really interesting. And it's a story about ideas and interests. And it's about how the economy can transform politics, even when it's politics that transforms the economy in the first place. And so let's talk about the political economy of ISI in Latin America. And the answer, the why not, has to do with ideas and with interests. And those ideas and interests themselves have to do with, well, the way that domestic industrialization affected politics and the way that, in particular, domestic industrialization interacted with the Great Depression to produce a set of ideas and interests that would be very, very resistant to liberalism and embedding domestic economies in the global economy. So we're going to do this in a way that begins with some conceptual perspectives that we'll use to make sense of the story. And the first thing that we've got to establish is that anytime that we have a policy, a economic policy, a social policy, preferences regarding that policy, preferences on that policy, whether an actor or a country opposes or supports it, will really be a product of two mechanisms. The first one is interests. And interests are benefits that derive from an actor's position in the economy. And so, workers and labor unions have interests that are usually different than the interests of employers and capitalists. Farmers often have interests that are different than the interests of industrialists or factory owners, and so on. Interests help us to understand what motivates and drives actors to make the choices that they make. Ideas also help to legitimate what motivates actors to do what they do. Ideas are mental models that help to provide actors with a set of beliefs about cause and effect relationships. And normally the way this works, and from my vantage point, is actors have interests, and then ideas serve as the handmaiden to interests. Ideas help to legitimate or validate or clarify or kind of illuminate the position or the preference that follows from a particular interest. And so ideas and interests work hand in hand. Interests create the motivation, the calculus that sort of favors a certain choice. Ideas help to create the legitimacy or the validation, the coherence, the basis for defending or invoking or justifying that position. One is sort of normative and kind of subjective, the ideas. The other is sort of more material and more physical, and those are the interests. And so interests really, this is where it gets really, really interesting, because the interest groups in Latin American political economy, they've been referred to as massive social forces. Massive social forces surrounded by feeble states, or massive social forces surrounding feeble states. We're talking about trade unions, we're talking about militaries, interest groups who have particular positions in the economy and who depend on preserving those positions so that they can continue their benefits. In the Latin American experience, the 2 decades of closure that basically spanned 1930 and 1947, that period between the beginning of the Great Depression and then the initiation of embedded liberalism, that 2 decades was a critical period. It created new interest groups. That closure and that domestic industrialization coincided with a rapid decline in the proportion of output that was constituted by exports. And so countries went from exporting a great deal at the beginning of the Great Depression to exporting almost nothing at all. So take the example of Mexico. 15% of the country's output was exports in 1929. Less than 4% was exports in 1950. What that means is that almost all of the economic activity is inward oriented. It's taking place in sectors that are producing for the domestic economy and who benefit from protections imposed so as to limit imports and so as to favor and protect domestic producers who benefit from high tariffs. As a result of this period of closure, the interest, the policy preferences, or the, the material interests on trade were divided on sector grounds. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the import competing sectors in industry, the ones who had benefited from high tariffs on imports, like the steel sector, the defense industry, petrochemicals, car production, these sectors were sectors that benefited from high tariffs. And so they competed with imports. Now, if they competed with imports, that means they would be opposed to embedded liberalism. They would be opposed to reducing tariffs. And they wanted to keep those walls up and maintain that protected domestic economy because it meant that they didn't have to compete with producers outside of their borders. On the other hand, those agricultural producers and farmers were primarily still producing for the international market. They were selling their beef and their grain for international markets. So if you were an Argentine rancher, you really depended on tariffs remaining quite low because you don't want it to be expensive for people to buy your beef and your grain. And so you wanted exports to be relatively free and unconstrained, and you wanted tariffs to be low. So agricultural and industrial actors had very, very different interests, but the import competing sectors, the industrializing sectors, were the ones who benefited from this period of closure, because this period of closure meant that the increase in tariffs helped to protect those domestic industries and helped to save them from outside competition, while suddenly those agricultural producers had a more difficult time accessing the international market because it became more expensive for outsiders to buy their products. Now, all the while, politicians took advantage of this situation by building strong coalitions around labor unions and industrialists who favored the protectionism. And so Juan Perón was a military colonel who was instrumental in using his post within the labor ministry to stimulate the creation of a new set of urban middle classes around new industries, and who opposed liberalism and who favored protectionism. Getulio Vargas in Brazil was also very well known for building strong coalitions around labor unions in protectionist industrialists. Again, these interests for closure and for protectionism benefited disproportionately from closure because it meant that new tariffs helped to make their products more and more competitive domestically as imports became more expensive. Now, the second mechanism that helped to reinforce and shape the response of Latin American countries was ideas. And the ideas are just as important because they help to validate and legitimate those interests, which primarily motivate actors but need to be justified or legitimated or understood or interpreted in some subjective light. And in dependency theory was that light. Dependency theory is very important in Latin America for reasons that we know already. And dependency theory became a critical component of this discourse in the justification for ISI, because dependency theory sketched out all of the different ways that the global economy disadvantaged developing countries, and in particular countries like Latin American countries who primarily produced and exported primary products and who historically had been inserted in the periphery of the global economy as opposed to the core. Now, before we continue, let's just really quickly review what are some of the key ideas behind dependency theory. What does dependency theory tell us? Let's hear from someone not who is not Matt. What are some of the key ideas behind dependency theory?
Dependency theory argued that like relationships would stunt development.
Okay, so what were the relationships that the Latin American countries were in that would stunt their development, according to the theory?
Mm, is it like could it like relate to them being an open economy?
So remember, it has to do with what they produce, what they mainly produce, and how trading those products with the products produced by the core countries disadvantages the peripheral countries. So let's get as many people in on this as possible. What did the Latin American countries primarily produce, even as they were industrializing? What was their main product, at least as far as what they were exporting? So Karina says developed countries um, keep other states to underdeveloped in order to continue extraction of raw materials. So all the pieces are right there, Karina. Very good. So underdeveloped countries are mainly exporting primary products and raw materials, right? Things like coffee, bananas, coca, silver, gold. Even though they're industrializing, most of what they export is still going to be, those primary products, right? Those relatively simple natural resources or agricultural products. What that means then is they're exporting those natural resources and primary products to developed countries, and then developed countries are exporting finished products like cars, computers, washing machines to Latin America. But we know that when that's the nature of the trading relationship, that creates what we call declining terms of trade for Latin America, because as the developed countries spend a higher and higher proportion of their income, or as they spend more and more, the proportion that they spend on food or on primary products does not increase. Whereas while the incomes of Latin American countries increase, they spend more and more on finished products. And so the terms of trade are unequal. And this was that idea that as long as underdeveloped countries are exporting primary products and importing finished goods, the trading relationship is going to be unequal, and the declining terms of trade are going to disadvantage Latin American countries because no one spends more and more and more on food and natural resources, whereas people do spend more and more and more on cars and washing machines, etc. Now, dependency theory, as a theory about how these relationships of dependence doom underdeveloped countries or peripheral countries to underdevelop it carries a number of ideas or prescriptions for national governments, like what they should do, how they should respond to relationships of dependence, so as to throw off the shackles of peripheral status and develop the domestic economy once and for all. And remember that this involved unplugging from the international economy in developing the domestic economy by using things like state enterprises, by using things like cheap credit provided by state owned banks, subsidizing development, all in the name of driving consumption of domestically produced goods. Now, this dependency theory that involved these relationships of dependence between core and peripheral countries this dependency theory was embraced by many governments in the region, and it became really a kind of rallying cry or basis for ISI. And the key proponents of dependency theory were Latin American economists, and Raul Prebisch was one of them. Raul Prebisch is a former student of the School of Economics at the University of Buenos Aires. And um, it's a really amazing place. This is a photo I took one day when I was going there. And I used to do research in the School of Economics. And in particular, I did research in the Institute of Economic Research. And I spent hundreds of hours in one archive in particular in this old classical building. And when you walk through the School of Economics and look at the halls, you see these big posters of Raul Prebisch. And Prebisch is a giant among men when it comes to the School of Economics in that time period. And I say giant among men because it was mostly women, was mostly men and few women. All the pictures on the walls are of men, very machismo. But the reason that they held Prebisch up as such a icon was because he was so instrumental in developing dependency theory, in developing the intellectual case for closure and for domestic development through ISI. ISI was viewed as the antidote for relations of dependence and subordination to peripheral status in the developing world. And so for Prebisch and for others, the idea was you've got to unplug from the global economy and you've got to focus on developing the domestic economy so as to overcome those declining terms of trade that will doom the domestic economy to underdevelopment if the state does not intervene. And so the goal of ISI, given this intellectual case for unplugging, is to facilitate industrialization by promoting domestic consumption of domestically produced goods. In the Latin American countries had really two focuses or foci, I guess. First of all, they figured we have these huge domestic markets, really, really large countries that can consume a lot, and we can use these domestic markets to basically drive the consumption of the goods produced by the industries that we need to develop. We also have an opportunity to turn inward and develop domestically the goods that we might eventually export. And so we can discourage exporting goods at the present so as to develop the domestic economy. And there really were three components of this strategy. First, high barriers to trade, both high import tariffs and high export tariffs. Tariffs, as we said, are just basically taxes that are levied on imported and exported goods. The higher the tariff, the higher the tax, the more expensive it is to import or export that good. And eventually it becomes almost prohibitive because it becomes so expensive. And so those countries that wanted to focus especially intensely on domestic production imposed especially high barriers to trade. There were also high subsidies to industry in the form of cheap credit provided by state-owned banks, oftentimes at virtually no interest rate whatsoever. The idea was free money can help to stimulate and promote the same consumption and the same development that high barriers to trade can. And then finally, state-owned enterprises. Not only do you impose barriers to trade and subsidize industry through cheap credit, tax breaks, and other kinds of sweeteners, you also make sure that the key enterprises of the economy are state-owned. And so basically it's what is in effect an entirely state-owned economy, or one that is mostly state-owned and one that involves a heavy role for state subsidies and state credit and state protections. this is the infant industry paradigm, the approach that involves growing the economy domestically first through a variety of different protections. Listen, everybody, we're out of time for now. We'll finish this on Wednesday, and I'll see you then. Have a good day.